The snow didn't just fall, it attacked. It came in sideways, a bitter, angry wind driving needles of ice into Millie Harper's face. She crouched at a lonely crossroads, a place where two dirt ruts gave up and went their separate ways, and she pulled her children closer. They were all she had left in this world. The wind howled, a hungry sound, and Millie knew it wanted to swallow them whole. She'd once had a life, a home with a warm oven and the smell of baking bread, a husband. But that was a lifetime ago. That life had been stripped away, piece by painful piece, until only this remained. The raw, gnawing cold and three little mouths to feed. Her oldest, Eli, was 8. He sat beside her, his small jaw set so tight she thought his teeth might crack. He was trying to be strong, trying to stare down the winter itself. He'd learned too young that a man's pride was sometimes all he had. Her daughter, June, just 6, was tucked into the thin fabric of her skirt, humming a little song that the wind kept stealing, as if a melody could build a fire. And little Sammy, only 3, was asleep against her chest, his breathing so shallow it scared her. He was giving up, she could feel it. She whispered the same words she'd been whispering for hours, a desperate prayer to an empty white sky. "I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook. Give me work, and I'll feed my young uns." Her voice was a ghost, barely there, but she kept saying it. Maybe if she said it enough, someone would hear. That morning she'd tried the town one last time. She'd gone to the back door of the inn, the one run by Clarabelle, a woman with a face as sour as old milk. Millie had begged for scraps, for dishes to wash, for a corner on the floor where her children could be warm. Clarabelle had looked her up and down, her eyes lingering on the last traces of beauty that hardship hadn't managed to erase, and she'd shaken her head. "We've no need for the likes of you," she'd said, loud enough for the men at the bar to hear. Their laughter had chased Millie back out into the blizzard. The sheriff was even worse. He hadn't even let her on his porch. He stood there, thumbs hooked in his vest, a big, important man. He told her the town wasn't a charity. "Best keep moving," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the empty street behind her. He couldn't even look at her children. Pride was a fragile thing, but it was the only coat Millie had left. She'd turned her back before the tears could fall, before her children could see her break. Now, at the crossroads, she wondered how much more they could take. She pictured them, still and silent, buried under the snow. The thought was a knife twisting in her gut. She rocked them, humming June's stolen tune, even though her own bones felt like they were turning to ice. "Mama's here. Mama will find a way." But she knew, deep down, she was lying. And as the sky turned from grey to a deep, unforgiving purple, she realized their time was running out. A sound cut through the wind, not the howl of the storm, but something else. The rhythmic clomp of horses, the creak of wagon wheels on frozen earth. Millie looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. A wagon was moving down the road, a dark shape against the endless white. A man sat at the reins, his shoulders hunched against the cold. His name was David McGrath, and he was hauling timber back to his ranch, his world as cold and empty as the landscape around him. He heard the faint, broken sound of a woman's voice, and for a moment he thought it was a ghost. He almost kept going. But then he saw them. A huddled shape at the crossroads. A woman and her children, looking more like statues of sorrow than living people. He pulled the horses to a stop. David just sat there for a long moment, watching. He'd buried his own wife 2 years ago. Fever took her, fast and cruel, and it had taken his heart with her. His house was a hollow, silent place. He hadn't thought he had any pity left in him. And yet, he looked at the woman. Her face was raw, her eyes red, but she wasn't begging. She just looked at him, a challenge in her gaze, as if daring him to see her, to see that she was human. Then the smallest child, Sammy, let out a weak whimper, and something inside David finally broke. He climbed down from the wagon. He was a big man, built like an oak, his beard thick with ice. He didn't say a word. He just shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one thing keeping him from freezing, and wrapped it around the 3 children. Millie blinked, startled. He hadn't asked. He just did it. "I've got room in the wagon," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My ranch is a mile from here. There's a fire." Millie stiffened. She'd learned the hard way that nothing was free. "We've no coin to pay," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't ask for coin." Still, she hesitated. Every offer she'd had came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. But then June shivered, a violent, rattling shake that seemed to go right through her. Eli looked at his mother, his proud mask cracking, his eyes pleading. That was it. Millie's resolve crumbled. She gave a single sharp nod. David lifted Sammy first, so limp and cold, and set him on the wagon seat. He helped the others up, wrapping them in rough blankets he pulled from a crate. Millie was the last to climb aboard. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. Hope was a dangerous thing. The wagon lurched forward, cutting new tracks in the fresh snow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and the straining horses. Millie watched the man beside her. His face was like stone, all sharp angles and shadows, but his hands on the reins were gentle. He never once jerked the horses. She wondered what kind of ghosts lived behind his silent eyes. Soon the ranch came into view. It was a big place, the fences nearly swallowed by the snow. The house stood against the darkening sky, smoke curling from its chimney like a prayer. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. But it was warm. That was all that mattered. David helped them down and led them inside. The air was thick with the smell of pine smoke and solitude. He pointed to the hearth. "Get them warm." Millie didn't need to be told twice. She moved with a desperate energy, stirring the embers, adding logs, her hands shaking. She built the fire up until it roared, a beast of warmth pushing back the cold. "You've done this before," David said. It was the first thing he'd said since the crossroads. She didn't look at him. "A fire's the difference between life and death," she replied. "I learned that young." He just nodded. He brought out some hard bread and salt pork and set it on the table. It wasn't much, but to Millie and her children it was a feast. They ate slowly, as if afraid the food might disappear. Later, when the children were asleep on quilts by the fire, a fragile peace settled over the room. Millie sat in a wooden chair, her chapped hands resting in her lap. She could feel David watching her. The warmth of the house was a strange comfort, but it was mixed with a new kind of chill. The chill of a debt she could never repay. "I'll work," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'll cook. I'll clean. Whatever you need. Just don't turn us out tomorrow." David leaned against the stone mantel, the firelight carving deep shadows on his face. "You'll do what you can," he said. "That's enough." It wasn't kindness. It was just a statement of fact. But for Millie, it felt like a lifeline. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, 4 lives had been pulled back from the brink. Millie watched the flames, thinking this silent, stern man had been their salvation. But as David McGrath looked at the widow he'd pulled from the snow, he wasn't thinking about salvation. He was thinking about the wanted poster tucked away in his desk drawer, the one with her face on it. And he wondered what in God's name he was going to do now. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Millie was up before the sun, her hands moving with purpose. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She filled the hollow house with the quiet hum of life. David watched her. He'd see her talking softly to the children, her face gentle in the firelight, and he'd feel a knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't the woman from the poster, the woman wanted for questioning in the death of her husband. It couldn't be. But he knew it was. He'd been tracking her for weeks, following the whispers of a desperate widow with 3 children moving west. He'd found her at that crossroads, half frozen and broken, and something had stopped him. He'd told himself he was just getting them warm before he took her in. Just a day or two, but one day turned into a week. Millie brought a warmth to his home that had nothing to do with the fire. He'd see Eli, her oldest, trying to mimic the way he chopped wood, his small face a mask of concentration. He'd hear June singing to the chickens as she gathered eggs. He'd feel little Sammy's hand slip into his as they walked to the barn. He hadn't realized how silent his life had become until he heard the sound of children's laughter echoing off the walls. He started leaving the wanted poster in its drawer. He started telling himself maybe the law had it wrong. Millie, for her part, felt the house changing. The shadows in the corners seemed to shrink. She was still wary of David. He was a closed book, his thoughts hidden behind those steady, unreadable eyes. But he was good to the children. He was patient and kind in a way that felt real. Still, there were things that didn't add up. There was a room at the end of the hall that was always locked. When she asked what was inside, he'd just say it was for storage, his voice flat in a way that ended the conversation. One afternoon, while mending one of his shirts, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird in the pocket. It was beautiful, worn smooth from being held. She showed it to him that evening. "This is lovely," she said. His face closed up like a fist. He snatched the bird from her hand, his fingers tight around the delicate wood. "Don't go through my things," he said, his voice cold as the winter wind. He turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, stunned and confused. The warmth she'd started to feel turned back into a familiar chill. This man was hiding something. That night, a blizzard descended, worse than anything they'd seen yet. The wind screamed like a banshee, and snow piled up against the doors and windows, trapping them inside. They were sealed off from the world. The storm raged for 3 days. Food grew scarce, the woodpile shrank. Millie stretched their meager supplies, giving most of her own portions to the children, a fact David noticed but said nothing about. The house grew smaller, the silence more pronounced. On the second night of the storm, Millie was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind, a scratching sound. And it was coming from the locked room. She sat up, her heart hammering. It sounded again. A desperate, rhythmic scratching. She crept out of her blankets and went to David's room. She found him standing by his window, staring out into the white maelstrom. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He didn't turn around. "It's just the wind," he said. "Rats in the walls." But Millie knew it wasn't rats. It was something else. The next day, Eli came to her, his eyes wide. "I saw him, Mama," he whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "I saw Mr. McGrath go out into the storm last night. He had a shovel." A cold dread washed over Millie. A locked room, strange noises in the night, a shovel in the middle of a blizzard. This man wasn't a savior. He was a jailer, and she and her children were his prisoners. She had to know what was in that room. While David was in the barn, Millie found a piece of wire from a broken broom. Her hands shaking, she knelt before the lock on the forbidden door. She wasn't a thief, but she was a mother, and her fear was greater than her conscience. She worked the wire into the lock, twisting, listening. After what felt like an eternity, she heard a soft click. The lock sprang open. She pushed the door open, her heart in her throat, expecting to find, she didn't know what. A prisoner. A body. But the room was just an office, a simple desk, a chair, shelves of books. She felt a wave of relief, followed by a flush of shame. He was right. It was just storage. She turned to leave, but then she saw it. Lying on the desk, weighted down by a rock, was a piece of paper. A wanted poster, and the face staring back at her, sketched in stark black ink, was her own. Wanted for questioning. The murder of her husband, Thomas Harper. Suddenly, the scratching sound made sense. The shovel. It wasn't about what was in the house. It was about what was buried outside it. And she knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins, that David McGrath hadn't saved her from the storm. He'd brought the storm with him. The words on the poster blurred. Millicent Harper. Wanted for questioning in the death of her husband. She sank into the desk chair, the paper trembling in her hand. It all clicked into place. The way he'd found her at that specific crossroads. His silence. His watchful eyes. He wasn't a kind stranger, he was a bounty hunter. He'd been hunting her, and he'd found her. She thought back to that night, the night Thomas died. The shouting, the breaking glass, the smell of whiskey, the man with the cold eyes who had come to collect on Thomas's debts. A man whose face was now burned into her memory. She hadn't killed her husband, but she had run. She'd grabbed her children and fled into the night because the man who did kill him, a man named Silas Kane, was the most powerful man in their county. He'd looked at her right after and told her if she ever said a word, he'd find her children and bury them where no one would ever find them. So she ran, and she hadn't stopped running until she'd collapsed at that crossroads. She looked at her own face on the poster, the hollow eyes, the desperate set of her jaw. David hadn't just stumbled upon her, he had tracked her. The door creaked open behind her. David stood there, his face grim. He didn't look surprised to see her in the room. He looked resigned. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice quiet. "You're a bounty hunter," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He nodded slowly. "I was." "You were going to turn me in," she said, her voice rising, "for a crime I didn't commit. You were going to let them take me from my children." "At first," he admitted, his gaze unwavering, "that was the plan. I followed your trail for a month. I heard the stories. A widow on the run. The law wants you, Millie." "The law is a man named Silas Kane," she cried, standing up, the poster crinkling in her fist. "He's the one who killed Thomas. He threatened my children." David took a step closer. "I know." Millie froze. "What?" "I kept tracking you," he said, his voice low. "But I also started asking questions in the towns you passed through. I heard about Kane. I heard about your husband. I heard about how you protected your children. By the time I found you at that crossroads, half dead in the snow, the bounty didn't matter anymore." "I don't believe you," she said, shaking her head. "You kept this hidden. You lied to me." "I didn't know how to tell you," he said, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than stone in his eyes. It looked like regret. "I saw how you were with your children. I saw the good in you. I burned the other posters. That's the last one." He looked past her, at the empty room. "This was my wife's office, Sarah. The fever took her 2 years ago. This house, it died with her, until you came." His confession hung in the air between them. Could she trust him? Was this another trick, a way to get her to lower her guard before he dragged her back to face a man who would surely see her hang? Before she could answer, there was a loud pounding on the front door. It wasn't the sound of a neighbor, it was hard, insistent, demanding. David's head snapped up. His eyes met Millie's, and in them she saw a new emotion. Fear. Not for himself, for her. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "It's the sheriff," he said, his voice tight. "Sheriff Hayes." Millie's blood ran cold. It wasn't the local sheriff. It was Sheriff Hayes from back home. Silas Kane's man. He had found her. He had tracked her all the way here. There was nowhere left to run. David turned from the window, his face a mask of grim determination. "Get the children," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Take them to the cellar and stay there. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Fear warred with suspicion in Millie's heart. Was this a trap? Was he handing her over? But the look in his eyes, it was the look of a man about to go to war. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She gathered the sleepy children, whispering that it was a game, a new hiding place. Eli knew it wasn't a game. He looked from his mother's terrified face to the grim set of David's jaw, and his own small face became a mirror of their resolve. Millie herded them down the narrow, dusty stairs to the root cellar, the smell of damp earth closing in around them. She settled them on a pile of old burlap sacks in the farthest corner and extinguished their only candle, plunging them into absolute darkness. Above them, she heard the heavy scrape of the front door opening. She heard Sheriff Hayes's voice, oily and confident. "McGraw, I know she's in here. Don't make this difficult." "I don't know who you're talking about, Sheriff," David's voice replied, calm and steady as a rock. "Don't play dumb with me," Hayes sneered. "I know what you are, a bounty man. I got a tip you picked up my runner, Millicent Harper. There's a hefty reward for her, but Silas Kane will double it. All you got to do is give her to me." There was a long silence. Millie held her breath, her hand clamped over June's mouth to stifle a whimper. This was it. The moment of truth. David would give her up. The money was too much. "She's not here," David said, his voice flat. "You're wasting your time." Hayes laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're a fool, McGraw. You have no idea who you're protecting. She's not some innocent victim." Millie's heart hammered against her ribs. What did he mean? What else could he possibly know? "She's a viper," Hayes continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You think her husband was the monster? Thomas Harper was a saint compared to her. You want to know what really happened that night? Ask her. Ask her what she did." What was he talking about? It was a lie, a trick to turn David against her. It had to be. "Get off my land, Hayes," David said, his voice dangerously low. or I'll put you off it myself." "Brave words," the sheriff mocked, "but you're alone." "I'm not." From the cellar, Millie heard the sound of more boots hitting the porch. He'd brought men with him. They were surrounded. Then Hayes said something that made the world tilt on its axis. "You know, it's funny. You and her. You've got more in common than you think. Both of you tangled up with the wrong people. For instance, I wonder what she'd think if she knew your wife, Sarah, didn't die of a fever at all." A suffocating silence fell over the house. Millie pressed her ear to the wooden slats of the cellar door, straining to hear. "What did you say?" David's voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a terrifying stillness. "Oh, you heard me," Hayes gloated. "Your wife got curious, started poking her nose into Kane's business, shipping routes, account books, things that weren't her concern. She found out too much. So Kane sent a man to have a little chat with her, to convince her to forget what she saw. A man named Thomas Harper." Millie gasped. Her husband, her abusive, drunken husband, had known David's wife. "It was just supposed to be a warning," Hayes said with a shrug in his voice. "But Thomas, he never knew when to stop. Things got out of hand. By the time I got there, it was too late. We made it look like the fever. Easiest thing in the world." The floorboards above groaned, a heavy thud, like a body hitting the floor. Then David's voice, no longer calm, but a raw, ragged roar of pure fury. "You lie." A gunshot exploded through the house, deafeningly loud. The children screamed. Millie pulled them closer, shielding them with her own body, her mind reeling. David's wife, her husband. This wasn't just about a bounty, it was a web of death and lies, and she and her children were caught right in the middle of it. The fight had begun, and she had a terrible feeling that no one was getting out of this house alive. The cellar was filled with the sounds of chaos, shouts, the crash of furniture. Another gunshot, this one closer, splintering the floorboards just above their heads. Dust and splinters rained down on them. Eli was rigid with terror, but his eyes were wide and alert. June was sobbing into Millie's dress. Sammy was just silent, a terrifying, unnatural stillness. Millie's mind was a whirlwind. David's wife hadn't died of a fever. Her own husband, Thomas, had killed her, and Sheriff Hayes had covered it up. This entire time, David had been living a lie, and Millie had been the one to bring the truth, violent and bloody, to his doorstep. He wasn't just protecting her now, he was avenging his wife. She had to do something. She couldn't just hide in the dark while he fought her battle. This was her fight too. Peering through a crack in the cellar door, she could see flashes of movement. David, using the big hearth table as cover, was holding his own against two of Hayes's men. But the sheriff was nowhere in sight. Where was he? Then she heard it, a scraping sound from the back of the house, the kitchen window. Hayes wasn't fighting fair. He was flanking David. He was going to shoot him in the back. Without another thought, Millie pushed open the cellar door. "Eli, stay with them. Don't move," she whispered fiercely. She scrambled up the stairs and into the chaos. One of the thugs saw her and grinned, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, a cast-iron skillet swung out of nowhere and slammed into the side of his head. He dropped like a stone. David stared at her for a half-second, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "I told you to stay down there," he yelled over the sound of gunfire. "He's in the kitchen," she screamed back, pointing with the skillet. David didn't hesitate. He dove behind a heavy armchair just as a bullet ripped through the spot where he'd been standing. The shot had come from the kitchen doorway. Hayes. Millie's eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, an advantage, anything. Her gaze landed on the fireplace. The embers were still glowing hot. Beside it sat a bucket of rendered lard she used for cooking and soap making. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in her mind. "Keep him busy," she yelled to David. She grabbed the bucket of lard. It was heavy, but her adrenaline was afire in her veins. She crept along the wall, staying low, out of the line of fire. She could see Hayes now, peeking around the doorframe, taking aim at David. He was focused. He didn't see her. With a desperate prayer, Millie swung the bucket with all her might. A great greasy arc of hot lard flew through the air, splattering across the floor right in front of the kitchen doorway. Hayes, startled by the motion, fired his gun. The shot went wide, burying itself in the wall. He took a step back into the main room to get a better angle, and his boot hit the slick, greasy floor. His feet went out from under him. He flailed, his arms windmilling, and he went down hard, his head cracking against the stone hearth. His gun skittered across the floor. The last of his men, seeing his boss go down, made a run for the door. But Eli was there. The boy, not content to hide, had crept up the stairs. In his hands was a thick piece of firewood. He swung it with all the force his 8-year-old body could muster, catching the man squarely on the knee. The man howled and collapsed. It was over. The house was suddenly deafeningly silent. Millie stood panting, the empty bucket still in her hands. David slowly rose from behind the chair, his pistol still aimed at the unconscious sheriff. He looked at Millie, at the skillet in her hand, at the lard-covered floor. He looked at Eli, standing protectively over his fallen foe, his small chest heaving. A slow smile spread across David's face, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his stony features. "You fight pretty good," he said, his voice laced with awe. "For a woman who can cook." The tension broke. Millie let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. She dropped the bucket and rushed to the cellar door, calling for her other children. June and Sammy emerged, blinking in the light, and ran to her. The family huddled together, a small island in the wreckage of the room. David walked over to the sheriff. He knelt and checked his pulse. "He's alive," he said, pulling rope from a nearby hook. "But he's not going anywhere." As David tied the sheriff's hands, his eyes fell on something that had fallen from Hayes's pocket when he fell. It was a small carved wooden bird, identical to the one David carried. He picked it up, his face paling. "Where did he get this?" Millie whispered. David turned the bird over in his hand. Carved into the bottom were 2 tiny initials, S.M. Sarah McGrath. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I carved it for her. She was never without it." He looked from the bird to the unconscious sheriff, and a new, terrible understanding dawned on his face. "Hayes wasn't just there that night," he said slowly. "He wasn't just covering for your husband. He was the one who held her down." The full weight of the day's horror settled upon them. This wasn't just a story of corruption and greed. It was a story of profound personal evil. An evil they had just defeated, together. They had not just survived, they had brought the truth into the light. The storm outside had finally broken. A sliver of pale sunlight cut through the clouds, streaming through the dirty window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent room. It was the first ray of sunshine Millie had seen in what felt like a year. The next few days were a blur. David rode to the next town over, the one where the law wasn't owned by Silas Kane, and returned with a federal marshal. The story came tumbling out. All of it. The murder of Sarah McGrath, the murder of Thomas Harper, the cover-up, the web of lies spun by Kane and Sheriff Hayes. The unconscious men were hauled away in irons. Word was sent back east. An investigation was launched. For the first time, Millie felt the weight of being a fugitive lift from her shoulders. She was no longer Millicent Harper, wanted woman. She was just Millie, a mother, a survivor. The town that had once scorned her was now abuzz with a new kind of whisper. Stories of her bravery, of David's stand against the corrupt sheriff. Clarabelle, the innkeeper, wouldn't meet her eyes when Millie went into town for supplies. The men who had laughed at her now tipped their hats. It was a strange and hollow victory. One afternoon, a week later, David found her standing on the porch, watching the children play in the melting snow. The world was muddy and messy, but it was alive again. Spring was coming. "The marshal says Kane has been arrested," David said, coming to stand beside her. "They found his ledgers, everything Sarah was looking for. She broke the whole thing open. It just took a while for the truth to catch up." "She was brave," Millie said quietly. "Yes," David agreed. "She was." He was silent for a moment, then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird. His bird. "I think you should have this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It's a symbol of hope, of a love that was strong and true. And you brought truth back to this house." Millie closed her fingers around the smooth wood. It was warm from his touch. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just watching their children. Eli was teaching June how to skip stones across a puddle. Sammy was chasing a butterfly. It was a picture of peace, a peace bought with blood and terror. Finally, David turned to her, his eyes serious. This house has been empty for too long, Millie. It needs a family. It needs you and your children. He took a deep breath. I know this is fast, and I know we both have ghosts. But maybe our ghosts can learn to live together. Millie looked at him, at this man who had gone from her captor to her protector to her partner. She looked at the home he was offering, a home built not just on kindness, but on a shared battle for survival and truth. She looked at her children, laughing in the afternoon sun, safe and warm for the first time in their lives. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time they weren't tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of hope. I think, she said, her voice trembling slightly, that our ghosts would like that very much. He smiled, that rare, true smile that made him look like a different man. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They fit together perfectly. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The memories would linger. But as they stood on that porch, with the promise of spring in the air, they weren't a broken widower and a hunted widow anymore. They were a family. And they were finally home. It just goes to show you that sometimes the deepest darkness comes right before the dawn. The human spirit can endure almost anything, and true justice, though it may travel a long and twisted road, will always find its way. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video.